Thank you very much, Kathleen, for your kind introduction. Thank you very much to the World Peace Academy for this invitation, which pleased me greatly. I always cherish coming here as a guest myself, so it's a great honour and a pleasure to be standing here in front of you in the new rooms, which are, of course, even nicer. When there was some difficulty in finding a date, as ever, but when we actually found a date which would suit both of us, I, for one, didn't quite realise, of course, what exactly this implied. So, and I certainly didn't kind of hang up my topic on this date. So if you will allow me, I will not start with Africa, but I will start with what was a very short night, or a very long night for some, whether you want to see it, whether you were part of it or not. We have just witnessed an incredibly intense, sometimes very bitter struggle in the in the electoral campaign of the United States, and I think probably the whole world has been observing, has been watching, has been judging, I wanted to, of course, use this as an entry point to my discussion today, and I hope it will be more of a discussion than a lecture as well, because I just want to be raising some points which I think sometimes get lost when one looks at democracy and democratization, especially looking at African countries, where one tends to compartmentalize what is going on there in a very specific way, which, in my opinion, is very often false and misleading. In any case, this is the election results, at least it was the election results at 10:37 a.m. This morning. I don't think very much has changed. Obama has come out victorious, and Mitt Romney is, if you want, the loser. As you know, it was quite tight right up to the last moment. It wasn't quite clear whether Obama really would emerge victorious, although he's the incumbent president. Now, when you look at this map here, blue is Democratic, red is Republican, so blue is actually the victorious party, political party, if you so want. If you had just landed from Mars or were completely unfamiliar with the media or with this public debate, you might actually be surprised when you look at this this map, because you might say, well, it's obvious, you know, the Red Party has won. But they have not. And not only have they not won, but they, you know, the Democratic Party has actually got quite a large margin. And this just points to some of the fallacies and some of the difficulties and complexities of a democratic system, and some would argue a very immature democracy. Others might argue a very immature democracy in other ways. But what actually struck me most, I was personally happy that Obama won. I was following the media. I wasn't up all night, but when I got up this morning, I did switch on my computer and check out all the media available, and I happened to see the victory speech that Obama held in his hometown in Chicago after it became clear that he was the winner. And I would just like to share 2 or 3 excerpts from this speech with you, because I personally found it quite rousing, actually, especially if one knows just how bitter this struggle was, and actually how bitter Obama himself fought in a quite untypical way as well. Okay, so these are just excerpts, but in some chronological order. Okay, he says, that's why we do this, these elections. That's what politics can be. That's why elections matter. It's not small, it's big. It's important. Democracy in a nation of 300 million can be noisy and messy and complicated. We have our own opinions. Each of us has deeply held beliefs. And when we go through tough times, we make big decisions as a country. It necessarily stirs passions. It stirs up controversy. That won't change after tonight, and it shouldn't. These arguments we have are a mark of our liberty, and we can never forget that as we speak, people in distant nations are risking their lives right now just for a chance to argue about the issues that matter, the chance to cast their ballot like we did today. But that doesn't mean that your work is done. The role of citizens in our democracy does not end with your vote. America's never been about what can be done for us. It's about what can be done by us together through the hard and frustrating but necessary work of self-government. That is the principle we were founded on. This country has more wealth than any nation, but that's not what makes us rich. We have the most powerful military in history, but that's not what makes us strong. What makes America exceptional are the bonds that hold together the most diverse nation on earth, the belief that our destiny is shared, that this country only works when we accept certain obligations to one another and to future generations, so that the freedom which so many Americans have fought for and died for come with responsibility as well as with rights. That's what makes America great. And he ends with saying, I believe we can seize this future together because we are not as divided as our politics suggests. We are not as cynical as the pundits believe. We are greater than the sum of our individual ambitions, and we remain more than a collection of red states and blue states. And so, I mean, Obama, for perhaps his weaknesses, he has shown as a president, I mean, he is a very stirring and inspiring speaker. But that's not why I shared it with you. The reason I shared it with you, because I think he points to some key issues in democracy and in the kind of messy part of democratic processes, everyday democratic processes. So what I would like to do with you, moving on, is talk to you about some more conceptual issues with regard to democracy and to democratic processes, which I would call, which I prefer to call them rather than democratization. I'll start off with some statistics. I'll get those out of the way very quickly. Looking actually at the way one measures democracy. We will then go on and talk a little bit about what are the features of democracy, because I think it's really important to understand a little bit more clearly, not just on a formal level, but what are the key principles and values of democracy, and why is it that democracy in making and democracy on an everyday level can be so difficult and does throw up a lot of difficulties. And then I hope to have time to go a little bit more into democratization processes or political transformations in Africa. I would like to talk a little bit about Kenya, but I'm happy to talk about other examples as well. And then close, obviously, with a personal view. Right. Democracy. Everybody talks about democracy. In fact, after the Second World War, there was a very well-known political scientist who is actually one of the Giovanni Sartori, who contributed very strongly to democratic theory, and he says, but nobody knows what it is. Everybody's talking about democracy. Nobody knows what it is. In any way, we are also talking, we're in an age where we're talking a lot about democracy. There's a range of indices looking at and trying to measure it. And if you look at it, this is Freedom House, you may be familiar with it, a research institute which does a lot of work on democracy and certain aspects of democracy. You'll find loads of information actually on their website, quite interesting. If you look at the world and slice up the world in three categories, you will have a majority which they call free. This is why they value freedom, democratic freedom, over other aspects. You will have a third, which is what they call partly free, and then 24% which are not free, which are under autocratic or authoritarian rule. So you can see actually that we are moving towards probably a world where democracy or democratization has become the most dominant model for political order. A few years ago, this would probably have looked quite different, this model. If we move to Africa, you will see perhaps a surprising picture, I don't know. This is the Middle East and North Africa. You can see here predominantly authoritarian regimes, whereas if we move to sub-Saharan Africa, an old and some would argue futile distinction between sub-Saharan and northern Africa, in spite of the Arab Spring, which is partly captured here, you will see that sub-Saharan Africa is actually, if you want to rank it, in a much better position than North Africa. So you have a greater part which are in the free or partly free areas than in the more authoritarian corner, which already, I think, goes against some stereotypes that we have of African countries. Here you have a slightly different measurement. This is compiled by the Economist intelligence unit. The Economist is a British magazine which also has a research part attached to it, in cooperation with the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, which compiles a governance index for Africa. I don't really want to go in, I don't find it particularly interesting to see what exactly distinguishes these different categories. They have a slightly more finely tuned taxonomy. But you will see here that basically, it's very difficult to see, I'm afraid, with this. You will see that the only fully fledged democracy is actually Mauritius, tucked away here, fallen off the map maybe. Southern Africa in particular, a couple of countries in Western Africa are what they call flawed democracy. Quite a large part are so-called hybrid democracies. So we can say these are not complete democracies. There are still some question marks or some issues which are problematic with regard to the practice of democracy. And then you have, especially here in Central Africa, quite a few authoritarian regimes and one of the failed states. Now, I don't know whether you think this is a positive image or a negative image. That depends probably very much from the type of work you're doing, the media that you're reading, probably also your political views. But let me assure you that this image would have been very, very different 20 years ago. What you can see here is, of course, just a static snapshot and a very arbitrary one with regard to the categorization. But, I mean, most African countries have changed dramatically in the last 20 to 30 years. With regard to stability, with regard to conflict, with regard to political structures, with regard to their economy, with regard to their infrastructure, with regard to the way their cities are developing, etc. So that is just one thing. I think these images are very powerful, but they can also be quite misleading, because what you don't see here is actually the dramatic changes which have been undertaken and which have happened. And that is something I think we are sometimes quite blind to. Okay, what I would like to do now is actually just leave this here for the moment. We will return back to Africa. But I would like to talk a little bit about some principles and key features of democracy, unless there are some pressing questions with regard to this image. Okay, what is it when we talk about democracy? What one of the key formulas was coined by, can you not really read that? It looks very nice on my screen, let me assure you. It's pink. I will read it to you. Okay, it's government of the people, by the people, for the people. You may be familiar with this. Very famous formula for democracy. He put it, like every good politician, just in one sentence which sticks to your mind. And that is the essence of democracy. It's government of the people, by the people, for the people. This is the substance of democracy. Basically, it deals with political power and the legitimacy of political power, which is only then legitimate, and this is the key feature, of course, of any democratic order, is when it is rooted in the people, when it expresses the people's will, and when it rests on an explicit social consensus. Now, this sounds intuitively plausible, and it sounds very attractive and seductive too. But of course, as you all know, when you start putting these ideas into practice, they become highly complex. And this, in a sense, is also quite an idealistic approach to democracy, where you have this very deeply democratic moment where the power is rooted in the people that govern themselves to an extent and expresses their values, their norms, their visions, their needs. A slightly different approach is a procedural approach, and I don't know whether you're familiar with Josef Schumpeter. He's an Austrian who, during the Second World War, moved to the United States, and there actually wrote a very famous, in the 40s, sorry, this is just the edition I was using, in the 40s wrote an extremely influential book called Capitalist Socialism and Democracy. And he famously coined this definition of a procedural idea of democracy. So where he throws this substance, this idealism out of the window, or shall we say, he puts it on a shelf. He doesn't actually profile it in any way, but he puts the procedure, the political procedure, on centre stage. And so his definition is, the democratic method is that institutional arrangement for arriving at political decisions in which individuals acquire the power to decide by means of a competitive struggle for the people's vote. Now, if you think about this definition, this is probably much closer to the political realities that we encounter in this day and age. So if you have been watching the election campaigns in the US, this competitive struggle can, in parts, be highly, highly bitter. And it is not necessarily about the will of the people, but perhaps it is more about individuals which acquire the legitimate and legal power to decide on behalf of others. So here already you can see a can of worms opening with regard to the more substantive values and principles of democracy. But this is also the essence of democracy, because what you can see here is another fundamental principle, and I would argue that that is a very substantive principle, which means that power is reversible. Democracy is probably key feature is that you can reverse power, the people in power, usually laid down by specific laws and procedures and regulations and a specific culture. So in the States, it's every 4 years you can choose a new president, etc. This is a little bit different with regard to the politicians and the members of parliament and the Senate, etc. But you have actually the means to influence who is in power, although of course this translation process is very difficult, as we all know. Now, I think in this day and age, and I'm actually talking about the year 2012, because this would probably not have been as clear. I would have put different aspects in even 20 years ago. So, of course, a basic feature is that government is based on a majority rule and the consent of the government. That is both a legal principle as well as a normative principle. So you have free and fair election based on political pluralism. So you may have free and fair elections, but if there is only one party allowed, there is not much choice to be made. A very important principle is the rule of law. So you have a hierarchy of norms, and these norms are actually, the pinnacle of these norms is the Constitution. Either the pinnacle or the foundation, however you want to look at it. But you have the basic laws and norms governing the organisation of political life laid down in the Constitution, and from there you have a hierarchy of norms which trickles down. And although you can already see here another tension, if you so want, although government is based on majority rule, absolute or representative, you need to have some kind of protection of minority rights and a respect of basic human rights. This has emerged very, very strongly since the Second World War, and even more so, I would argue, in the last 20 years or so. Okay, there is a lot one could say about these basic features. One of them is, of course, that they do evolve from Western experience and Western history. So these features have evolved from a very specific historical experience, but they have acquired a kind of a universal status, as you saw with that very first cake that I showed you, where the majority of states are heading in the way of at least ticking some of the boxes on here. And I think it's quite interesting to discuss maybe later this historical experience as well. Okay, this is just the methodology that Freedom House uses. You can see here that they base their index on political rights and civil liberties. These are the two dimensions that they look at. I just thought that might be interesting for you to see what exactly is being measured, what exactly is seen to be key to gauging the quality of a political system. Okay. What I would like to dwell on for a moment are three tensions which, in my opinion, are quite fundamental to democracy. And they're fundamental in every sense. They're fundamental to the principles of democracy, but they're also fundamental in the difficulties that kind of democratic processes and political orders that are founded on democratic principles encounter. It belongs, I think, to the nature of democracy that one struggles with these aspects. So allow me to move to the first one first. This is the formal versus what I've termed the formal versus the substantive. Now, you already saw this in these definitions that I chose. You have on the one hand a formal democratic procedural and institutional framework, but democracy has a more substantive aim. I'm not just talking about certain values here, like liberty, for instance, but ultimately it has the empowerment and the emancipation of the citizens. That is one of the aims of democracy, that people should lead a freer and better life. Now, as you all know, in the 90s, a wave of democratization swept mainly across Africa, actually. A large part of African states which had been under one-party rule, under authoritarian rule, were democratized. Be it because they were made to democratize, because they were at a point where they had no choice, be it because citizens rose up and actually swept the powers that be away. And there was a huge wind of hope as well, that one felt this is really a new beginning. People talked of the third wave of democratization that has swept across the world and is changing the face of the world as well. Only a few years later, there was already a great sense of disenchantment and disillusionment and cynicism in the air. And an eminent Nigerian political scientist named Claude Ake talks of the democratization of powerlessness. Because what happened, and this was already in the late 90s, I mean this was only a few years after these regimes had transformed, if you so want. And what he describes is basically this change in formal institutional and procedural rules. So, for instance, the introduction of multi-party politics, regular elections, etc., etc. But apart from those formal rules, on the ground, nothing changed. Those who had authority over political and economic power before, they maintained that control over it. And there was no democratization of social and economic and political power down to the grassroots, if you so want, to the citizens, to the people who are living out there in the village. And he talks in a very disenchanted way about the trivialization of democracy. Because with that, and I think it is something that we have probably all encountered, you actually take the heart and the spirit out of democracy, because it becomes a farce then. Democracy is not just about changing rules, it's about changing the life and opening up political spaces and opening up opportunities, what Amartya Sen calls opportunities and freedoms to people. So that is a tension which we have, which became very clear in a very difficult way in many African countries. It is a recent example, but it is actually something which is inherent in democracies. And I'll just open the bracket if you look at the United States. I mean, one thing that President Obama stands for, of course, is for the hope of those who have actually been excluded from democracy. And I will say another thing, the civil rights movement is not long ago, where a major part of the population, or a major part of the population, was excluded from partaking, even in the formal rules of the game. Not to mention universal suffrage, for instance, but I just want to draw your attention to the fact that many of these aspects are actually very new. If you look at a historical perspective, these are very new gains that we have made. We may take it for granted, but this, in the last 100 years, what democracy means has already changed quite dramatically. And these are struggles that are fought in every election campaign about what exactly this implies. I will move on to the second pair that I have put together, and that is this tension between universal norms and values and particular norms and values. As you know, Max Weber famously characterized the modern state as governed by a universal, impersonal, bureaucratic, legal rationality. So the rationality that modern states are founded on is, in essence, highly bureaucratic and impersonal. Without anger and bias. So if something is codified, if something is put down in a legal rule or in a regulation, then it should be applied according to the letter of the law, and not whether you as a civil servant like this person, dislike them, whether they're related to you, whether they do you a favour or not. So this is highly impersonal. Now, this, of course, in itself creates a tension because we are all humans. And the way that we work in practice is not just in this very brittle, shall we say, very dry way. All of us will have some kind of affective, emotional, or other value system which will be part of the way we work, and luckily too, because Max Weber actually goes on to describe the iron cage of bureaucratization, where we are all caught, where we are completely dehumanized because we are only governed by this bureaucratic cage or legal bureaucratic cage which we created ourselves. Now, the question is, of course, if this legal rationality governs democracy, because that guarantees that it is applied universally and impartially, what do we do with these other rationalities, with other values, with other ways of relating to people? And I don't think we have to go as far as the clash of civilizations which Samuel Huntington invoked to know that in all working democracies there is contestation and debate about which values, which norms should be included in everyday political practice and work. And it is sometimes quite difficult to maintain that balance. And as you know, many countries solve that in different ways. There are also different political cultures which govern that. So if you have the stereotypical Prussian state, for instance, who is governed by the letter of the law, as opposed to maybe a southern Italian civil servant who may be much more emotional, personal in the way that he or she deals with citizens, you can see these are the kind of cultures which in every democracy differ. Right, the third pair, which I think governs some of the key tensions in democracy, is this idea of a competition. Democracy is based on political competition. That is a core feature. But, so this idea that we can and need to disagree, the core of our political system is that we have different political parties which want different things. They have different interests, they have different ideals, they have different objectives. So it is based on an institutionalized dissensus. Democracy only works if we don't agree with each other. But of course, democracy only works if we also find some way of agreeing with each other. And so there is a real danger also of instability inherent in democratic political orders, especially in those which are not deeply institutionalized and do not necessarily have a shared political culture. And I think we have seen, for instance, in the United States, that there has been a huge amount of division. The politics have not been stressing cohesion so much as division. And it is no wonder that Obama in his victory speech stresses unity so much. And there is the fear of social cohesion, but we can also see that I think this also has to do with a close nexus between democracy and capitalism as well. Capitalism as well is based upon competition, with a particular economic regime. And if we look at some of the states in Europe, for instance, if you look at Greece, probably if you look at Spain too, Portugal I'm not so familiar with, you will see that there is a real fear that this social cohesion is getting lost. And in these times as well, people will look to more authoritarian leaders as well, who present a much clearer picture, not such a messy and muddied picture. Okay. I would like to return back to Africa. Like I said, African countries, I think, have been quite remarkable in the sense that they have gone radical, fundamental political transformations, not only political, but also economic and social transformations in the last 20 to 30 years. I think more so than is acknowledged, certainly not in the mainstream media, but also by a lot of researchers dealing with these topics. And I would just like to mention some of these factors which I think have framed the political transformations which are undergoing and have been undergoing in African countries, because I do actually feel that they are not really validated enough. I think especially Western public is very quick in condemning seeming stagnation or conflict, not understanding quite the complexity of the context in which African countries are embedded in. I will just open a bracket here. I think the crisis in the European Union is an excellent lesson for the, in my opinion, hubris of many Westerners, because I think it shows that failing states or political order or economic welfare are not just a given, but that they are fragile and that they really need to be fought for, and that is not just a matter of historical, fortune or something. It's something which one really needs to fight through, and very often, and especially in a globalized world, one falls prey to forces which are outside of one's own control as well. Anyway, let me return to Africa, because I think one could make a similar case for European states as well, obviously, with different factors. You obviously have a specific historical backdrop, very broadly here. I will mention the slave trade and colonialism, of course. I think they have very fundamental effects to this very day. The latter, not least, as is well known, the boundaries. And only a couple of states since independence have actually changed their boundaries in Africa to this very day. I mean, that is quite surprising. Post-colonial states, I think, are framed mainly by four aspects. I think the Cold War was incredibly formative processes of economic liberalization and political democratization, which started in the 80s and reached their peak, I would say, in the 90s. And then, in a similar period, massively accelerated processes of globalization. If you will allow me, I will quickly go into these. Now, why do I mention the Cold War? Obviously, I'm not going back to the time of independence. I'm sure there are other factors here. But I think the Cold War, to this very day, plays an influential role in the way that political orders in African countries have evolved. As you probably all know, there were very systematic interventions into African politics, especially in the early years of independence. Well, and of course many of the independence struggles were around these geopolitical and geostrategic, were framed by these geostrategic interests too. So here already you can see that politics was subject to a lot of interests which had very little to do with the will of the people, whatever that will may have been. It also supported over decades illegitimate regimes. I only need to mention former Zaire under Mobutu, for instance, who wasn't just a puppet of foreign forces, of the Western world in this case. He was a very powerful, a very cunning and very strong man, but over decades you had a government which meant nothing to the people, or in a very different way than we would think. And it nurtured, of course, a culture of accountability, because people in this sense had absolutely no influence over who ruled them, who governed them. They could accommodate within that, but they had no influence over it. And of course, to this day, I don't know whether you've read in the media, the conflict in Mali, for instance. If you talk to, I happened to be in Bamako in January, just a couple of weeks before the coup happened. And the people I've been talking to since from Bamako, they said, everything's fine as long as the French don't intervene. Because there is still this highly colonial reflex there. Okay, a second aspect which I find to this day has had very dramatic effects in a very short time is economic liberalisation. Now I know this is going back a bit. This started with the structural adjustment programs and the neoliberal politics of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. But for African countries at that time, many of them were more or less bankrupt. There was a global economic crisis. So they had to undergo, half pushed, half pulled, quite fundamental economic adjustment policies. This also entailed the privatisation of major public services, and it also entailed changing flows of external finances coming into the country. I happened to be in Tanzania in the early 2000s, so this is already going on a bit. And corruption at that point was rampant. It was one of the main political agendas. And when I talk to people about corruption, especially sort of grand corruption, they said, well, there's nothing we can do. There is so much money coming in, and it has corrupted the minds, not just of our politicians, but it has actually corrupted the people. Because with capitalism, and I'm not meaning this as a capitalism critique, but of course the values of capitalism and the principles of capitalism are founded on profit. And so making profit becomes then a driving force of a whole country, and this in a very, very short time. We're not talking about decades, we're not talking about centuries, we're talking about a couple of years here. And of course, without necessarily the institutional framework to actually contain and control these changes and these reforms. More or less at the same time, we witness political democratization, and what is interesting there is, again, we have a fundamental transformation of basic values, of basic political practices, of a basic political culture in a very short time. And I'm always quite surprised that we expect so much of countries in such a short time, that these practices and these policies just emerge and work, when we can see that they don't work that well in Europe, they don't work that well in the States, they don't work in other places. The other problem is that political democratization became very much like market-based economy. Multi-party democracy became kind of a panacea for political development, which meant that especially development agencies and international organizations were putting a lot of pressure onto democratizing according to a very set model of democracy. So this is not necessarily an expression of the people's will, but it was very much an expression of, I'll be a bit clever, of the World Bank, of DFID, of SDC. Okay, and lastly, we have globalization. I won't go too much into that, but I do think it plays an incredibly important role, and especially if we talk about corruption, for instance, because what you can see here, we have highly lucrative assets in many African countries. It's very easy to exploit them and to hide those assets. But no, we don't have to go into gold and diamonds and coltan. I was talking about the privatization of public services. I mean, it's horrendous if you see what happened with the privatization of power, for instance, of water, and other important aspects where some people got very rich and the citizens still don't have any power and they don't have any water. Okay. Now, I'm not quite sure how much time we've got. I can see you.
4:45, you can divide your time as you wish.
I think people will start crying if I talk until 4:45. What I will do is I will just very briefly talk about Kenya and then move on to my conclusions, because I would like to have some time for discussions. So I apologise if I kind of plough through this a little bit. Now, I don't know who of you are familiar with the Kenyan elections of December 2007. They were quite remarkable because Kenya is a country which, certainly in the Western eye, was seen to be kind of a beacon of economic and political development in Eastern Africa. And what happened there is that after the presidential elections, there was allegation of fraud and abuse. There were incredibly vicious post-election violence, which were orchestrated, obviously, by some key politicians. There were about 1,500 victims and about 300 to 350,000 internally displaced people. Unheard of in, not that there has been, that there has never been post-election violence, but the extent of it, unheard of. Now what you can see here are the incumbent president, Mwai Kibaki. He apparently had 47%. The challenger, Raila Odinga, he had 44%, and this is how, much like the red and blue states of the US, here they were orange and blue states in Kenya. Now, you can nearly place this map over the other one, and this map depicts the ethnic composition of Kenya. There has been a lot, especially in Western media, a lot of talk about the kind of tribal and ethnic disputes, and putting it down to essentially an ethnic conflict. And I think that is one very easy way of depicting it. It fits into a lot of the images that we have of kind of neo-patrimonial politics in Africa. But of course, if you take a closer look at it, it is not quite as easy as that. There are colonial roots to this. Not just the boundaries, if I may add, but also the way in which ethnicity was constructed, which ethnic groups were privileged, which were excluded. So that is certainly one legacy. Another legacy is a lot of the legal norms are inherited from colonial times. Only recently were a lot of them thrown out and revamped. It is rooted in post-colonial times, particular ways in which aid flows, for instance. These, like I was saying, these regimes were being supported, the way in which political loyalty was being rewarded, and increasingly so, especially with the introduction of multi-party elections, with the premium that is accorded to political vote. The political struggle becomes much sharper through the increased importance of competition, and with that, the control that you have over certain resources. So perhaps it is not a surprise that these kind of divisions get enhanced along certain lines. I will not go into this. This is a timeline of events and reforms, but basically what you will see here is that Kenya itself has undertaken a lot of I wanted to show some of the strategies and some of the practices in which Kenya itself has addressed it, but also the way in which, in this case, Kenya is embedded in an international order as well, with the involvement of the International Court of Justice, with the constitutional reform, etc. So I just wanted to illustrate with that, on the one hand, that countries are specific, have a specific political order which is embedded in a history, but the way that also there are many steps that are being taken, which I think very often we are blind to. We are also blind to the time that it takes for political change and political transformation to happen. Particular salient is here that the elections are scheduled to take, these are some of the candidates for the election in Kenya. Salient is on the 4th of March 2013, the elections are due to take, the presidential elections are due to take place, and in April, two of the candidates, Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto, are due to stand trial in the ICC. So if they are elected president, Kenya might end up with a president who is in front of an international court of justice. Anyway, those are other aspects. I would like to come to my conclusions and hope that we will have time for discussion. I'm sure you know this quote by Winston Churchill, very wise person. I think we overrate democracy. I think we think too little about what democracy actually means. Everybody is talking about democracy, everybody is emphasizing the importance of democratization, but democracy is actually hard work. It's exactly what Obama said. It's about struggle, it's about hard work, but it's also about a political vision. And these are some of the conclusions I would like to draw. I think it is important to understand that, especially in the context of African political transformations, we are talking about an incredibly short time. If you want to go back to independence, that is, half a century. If you go back to the democratization processes that have taken place, we're going back 20 to 30 years. That is nothing. In fact, in brackets, I heard one commentator talk about the US elections and about the problems that it churned up and saying, well, I don't think people understand the US is still a very young democracy. So, seeing the US and France are probably the oldest modern democracies, I think this should put some things into context. Democracy is messy, it's complex, and I think we feel that by just creating democratic processes, we will we are taken out of that messiness and that complexity. And I think what is very often not seen is there are the micro-struggles, the struggles by citizens, by organizations, by groups, by just people on a local level, on a provincial level, on a national level, to create those processes. And democracy is a dynamic thing. And lastly, and this is one thing I have not talked about, but I think it is also important, and I think the Arab Spring showed that very forcefully. We are living in a time where we actually lack a political vision for what democracy should be like. That is not necessarily of this Western mould. And I do think that is, I am really surprised that even after the financial crisis, even now with the Eurozone in crisis, there is very little debate about that, even here. And I think any visions of what democracy could mean and the way it could be exercised in a meaningful way, not just for Western societies, but in Northern Africa, in Latin America, in their own way, I think we lack that, and I'm hoping very much that. I also think it's quite an exciting age we live in, because I think this is something which will be emerging as well. Anyway, I will stop talking before you all start crying and hope for a discussion. Thank you.